Welcome back to the KRUSE Elite podcast. What's up, Tony?
What's up, man? Do I detect a little bit of congestion again?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I've got a head cold. I felt like I escaped getting sick about like a week and a half ago because my daughter had something. And I thought I escaped it, but then it was either yesterday or the day before I woke up and I was like, oh, man, it's got me. So pretty typical post masterclass build up, post sales process for our courses because we just ended our big enrollment. And I'll tell you what, that month is the hardest month of the year. It's the busiest month of the year by a long shot. I mean, the build up to the masterclass and then the enrollment process brings the most back end work that you could imagine. And then when we get to finally teaching the courses, it's so much easier, and it's funny. Cool. I mean, it is good to be at that point because, years ago, it was just the sales process was very hard. Teaching was very hard. Like everything was very hard. So at least now when I get to the teaching part, I'm like, all right, I can kind of take a deep breath and we can start flowing. And yeah, so I got a cold. It usually gets me this time.
Yeah, bummer, man. Bummer.
So hopefully I can kick it soon.
Yeah, hope so. I was just, I'm just going to brag for a second. I was just in Panama.
Yep.
And so I got to miss the cold, but I always get really paranoid from the flights that I'm going to get sick because there's always someone like one seat over that's coughing or sneezing. And you're just like, man, I have nowhere to go.
Right.
Airport exposure, right?
Traveling is tough. It's tough on the body.
Yeah, and like it dries you out, right? Like all that recycled air in the plane, and anyways. So I'm knocking on wood over here.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, really, really, really interested in the topic today. A while back, I guess I'll just start with this story. We were talking about Indian clubs because I had some Indian clubs, and like I was describing to you just how. What's the word I use? How dumb I feel when I'm using them and trying to do like alternating movements with left and right.
Right.
And just coordinating, like doing those. I'm already forgetting the word for the exercise, but when you like do a circle in front of the body and then it comes behind your head and you do another circle. It's like two loops, right?
Right.
I can do one side just fine. I can do the other side just fine. But when I try to alternate them together, I get, my brain just stops functioning.
Yeah, totally.
And you sent me a video of you doing not just that, but then also alternating whether you're starting in the front, like in front of your body or behind.
Yeah.
And like part of me is just like, well, he's just built different. Like, I don't think I could ever do that. But part of me wonders, it's like, how do you get that level of coordination, right?
Right.
And so, in talking about this stuff, you have recommended complex movements as sort of having a benefit of their own. And so I thought it'd be really great to talk about complex movement training and that coordination, from a neuro perspective and why you use it and what it's good for and how you train it to get better at it.
Yeah, I love the topic. Yeah, I was excited when you mentioned this one. Where shall we begin?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's worth just talking about why complex movement training is valuable at all. Like, why do we even care that someone can juggle or that you can do this Indian club movement with both hands, right?
Yeah.
Alternating. Like does it even matter? Because I think there's a school of people who would say, well, you can get stronger just by doing the basics, overhead press, squats, deadlifts. Like what do we need this stuff for?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. With traditional kinds of training, if we're talking about strength training, everything that we do inside of a gym is generally pretty linear, right? If you think about the normal things, the common things that people do, squat, deadlift, lunge, push, pull, press, all those types of movements. It's pretty linear, right? There's not a whole lot of complex like coordination that goes into those things. Although I would not say that they're not coordination, because you have to be coordinated. You have to have motor control to control resistance through whatever range of motion that you're using. So it's still coordination. It's just not as complex as if we are doing different forms of dual tasking or creating shapes with our movement that are more curved in nature. So if you think about the difference between what it looks like to see what a person is doing in a gym, and then you compare that to watching like some kind of contemporary dancer, it's like, oh, whoa, like the dancer's not doing linear stuff, right? It's got a lot of curvature to it, a lot of big gross movement patterns that have circles and figure eights and lots of combinations of those things happening at the same time, right? So that's kind of what we're thinking about when we say, okay, this is more like complex in nature. Like inside our courses, when we talk about training using complex nonlinear movements, we share with people what we call the shapes continuum, which is basically kind of it's a visual of movement that sort of begins rather simple, like let's say an isometric, where you're contracting, but there's no, I don't want to say there's no movement, but like just to simplify it, we're going to say an isometric is no movement, even though that's not true. But on this shapes continuum, an isometric would be represented by a dot, just a dot on a piece of paper, okay? And then as you move to the next shape, that dot then becomes, let's say, a semicircle, right? A curved line. And then that curved line becomes a full circle. And then that full circle becomes, let's say, a horizontal figure eight. And then the next shape on the list would be like a vertical figure eight. And then the next shape on the list might be kind of a diagonally oriented figure eight. And then the next shape is another diagonally oriented figure eight. And then the next shape looks like a flower because it's taken all of the figure eights and it's overlapped them almost in the cardinal directions of a compass. And so we use this visual to help people understand what we would consider less complex. Okay, and actually I forgot the line. Technically, right. We start with a dot, which is the isometric. The next one is just a straight line, right? So you get the idea. And the reason why this is important to understand when we're talking about using complex movements, because as we get deeper into neurology, we spend a lot of time talking about the cerebellum, which is the structure that we're most interested in targeting when it comes to complex nonlinear movements, because the cerebellum is really the home of accuracy, balance, and coordination. So it's the brain area that is largely involved in helping us coordinate these complex tasks. So this shapes continuum is kind of a key to use so that when you're working with people or training yourself, it's not only a reminder that we want to incorporate some more complex movements, but we also use it like working with a client. You know, you might start somebody with a line and, you know, using the assess reassess process, maybe that didn't really create change if we're talking about some sort of joint mobilization. Because obviously our mobility drills are one of our big foundational tools. So maybe you try something with a line, you don't really get a real change, okay? Not enough activation, let's say. The brain really wasn't paying attention to it because it's more linear. But then we move forward on the shapes continuum to the circle. And then rather than performing a movement linearly, we perform a circular movement, assess, reassess, and maybe now we get a change. And typically that's what you experience, is that as you move somebody more towards these complex movements, you get more engagement out of the person, you get more engagement out of their brain, and therefore we start to see some really positive increases in the basic assessments that we might be using. So yeah, it's this idea of complex movement is a really interesting one, and there's so many ways. Like there's so many things we could talk about with complex movement, because some of these things, like I just described, are more isolated, right? We're using this shapes continuum in a more isolated joint mobilization, but then sometimes, maybe we're talking about juggling, right? Hand-eye coordination types of tasks that require a great deal of accuracy, and so there's a lot of possible, stones to turn over here.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about probably the first complex movement that I learned, and that was rubbing my belly in a circle and patting the top of my head at the
Yep.
same time.
Yeah,
And
that could
if
be
you've never
considered a
done it
cerebellar
before-
drill.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is that something you've ever used as an assessment or as a stimulus?
For fun, yes, like to be funny, because we have so many other cerebellar type assessments. But yeah, that's like a
Right.
form of dual tasking where you're doing. And interestingly enough, I do a lot of like when I'm helping people program ideas for training the cerebellum. Oftentimes, we're doing that. We're creating a movement pattern on one side of the body that is more novel, more complex in nature than the movement that's happening on the other side of the body. And there are reasons for that based on like hemisphericity and, trying to activate one side of the cortex or one side of the cerebellum more than the other. So we're essentially upregulating activity on one side of the body, maybe thinking about it anyway as down-regulating it on the other side of the body. Because really with neurology, that's typically in most scenarios, that's typically what we're trying to do.
Right.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. Pat your head, rub your belly. Could be a neuro drill.
So when you say the cerebellum, one of the first things I think about from previous episodes is gait assessments. And I believe, and tell me if I'm totally hallucinating this right now, one of the potential
patterns
that you can find, thank you, is a cerebellar deficit.
That's right.
So maybe it's worth just sort of setting the stakes, like what's going on if someone has a cerebellar deficit?
Yeah.
And why would it be useful to activate the cerebellum?
Yeah, so it's cool. You can see it's kind of neat because so we're about to do our cerebellar testing next week in our foundations course. Yeah, so I'm starting to think about this. We're going to get into all the basic cerebellar assessment flows, which are essentially coordination assessments. And you make a side-to-side comparison. So right side, left side. So for example, and our listeners can try this. If you place one hand in front of you, palm up, okay, your hands are pretty close to your body, elbows bent. So let's say your left hand is palm up. Your fingertips are together, so your hand is like bladed, it's flat. And you take your right hand and you place it on top of your left hand, palm down. The idea would be to very quickly, as quickly as you can, with the right hand, hit your palm on your target, which is your left palm, and then flip your hand over and hit your knuckles. And then flip your hand over and palm, knuckles, palm, knuckles, and you try to go as fast as you can. So you're making this, this flipping type motion, which is essentially pronation and supination of the forearm. Your shoulder is not really super involved in this. Other body parts are not supposed to be super involved with this. And you do that assessment for, let's say, 6 seconds as fast as you can. And then you make a side-to-side comparison against your left. And what we're trying to do, and we have similar assessments for the whole body like this, what you're trying to do is determine what side of the body has more or less coordination. And that gives you a direct idea of where a potential cerebellar deficit might be living. Is it in the right cerebellum? Is it in the left cerebellum? Is it both? And to go even further than that, we talk about zones of the cerebellum, because when you look at the actual anatomy, the cerebellum is kind of divided up into these different zones. You could almost think about it as like body maps, if you will, where if I do a cerebellar assessment, like I just described, the hand flipping, that corresponds to a specific zone of the cerebellum, more so what we would look at as the intermediate cerebellum. And we have additional cerebellar tests that give us information on what we would call the midline cerebellum, and then also the lateral cerebellum, which is starting to get more distal in nature, like hands and feet, right? And there's even like, cognition is also involved in the lateral cerebellum. But the point being is that when we understand these zones, we can assess them and get an even more targeted idea of like what part of the cerebellum might need the training, because somebody might have an intermediate cerebellar deficit on their left, but they don't have, let's say, a lateral cerebellar deficit. In knowing that, it helps your approach. It helps your drill selection. It helps you choose things to train that person to hopefully then see an improvement in the function of their intermediate cerebellum. So, and the cool thing is it's so straightforward, because a lot of people who are teaching movement and observing movement get pretty skilled at seeing when movement doesn't look right, whether it looks lower quality or something is more dysrhythmic about it. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the cerebellum, you're trying to evaluate rhythm. You're trying to evaluate accuracy. You're trying to evaluate coordination. So if I do the hand flip test and I notice that the person gets out of rhythm, the speed is changing, like the tempo is changing, or I gave them instructions to keep their fingertips together, but they're struggling to keep their fingertips together when they do the motion, and it becomes flippery, right? It becomes flippery. They're not able to maintain the same level of coordination throughout the duration of the test. We're looking at that and going, okay, that's starting to look like a struggle for them. So we're going to correlate that to, let's say the right cerebellum. So we can do that all over the body and then make more informed drill selections to try to improve it. And you had mentioned Gait. Gait's a really interesting one, because even though we say the cerebellum is primarily, about accuracy, balance, and coordination, that's how we talk about it most of the time. But it is also a structure that is super involved with the regulation of muscle tone. And so any structure that is involved with muscle tone in a impactful way, it means that you can watch a person walk, or you can look at their posture, and you can actually get feedback or clues about whether or not they have a cerebellar deficit. So we actually, when we do gait analysis, we teach about what a cerebellar pattern looks like in gait, which very quickly, and there's a whole episode on this if people want to check it out on, I forget what we titled it exactly, but it's like gait analysis or gait analysis,
the neuroscience of walking or something.
Yes, you're exactly. So we can look at gait and we can go, all right, this person is showing, let's say, both arms are quite internally rotated at the shoulder, and both legs are quite internally rotated at the hip. This is actually a pattern that would suggest there is possibly a bilateral cerebellar deficit. Okay. Now you can have this issue on one side of the body, which would be, let's say I have a left cerebellar deficit that's significant enough that it's turning out, we're able to see it in my gait. I may have an upper limb that is internally rotated at the shoulder, possibly with some protraction of the scapula, because the cerebellum is very much involved in regulating extensor-based muscle tone. So if you think through that, if my flexors are winning the battle, meaning like my pec major and my pec minor, and I'm losing extensor tone proximally at the shoulder, that may look like a winged scapula because I don't have appropriate extensor tone, or maybe we should say a balance of muscle tone in that area. So that may lead to the internally rotated shoulder, which if you ever just look around and what people are talking about with posture, that's one of the main concerns people have. Shoulders being internally rotated. And so people say, oh, that's easy. Just release the pec. Well, why would releasing the pec do something? Because, it's like we're not a piece of clay. You don't get to just say, hey, a little bit of length right here, please. And let's, lengthen out the pec and okay, you're good. Right? These muscles or these compartments of muscles are getting information from the brain. And it's not just the cerebellum, but in this case, the cerebellum is very much involved in that. Now, on the lower body, it's a similar kind of idea. If I have a left cerebellar deficit in the lower body, my leg is going to be internally rotated to some degree. And once again, we can kind of look at that and go, oh, so that's a potential loss of extensor tone. So it's neat because we can take gait assessment and maybe we say, okay, I think I'm seeing, a little cerebellar deficit in gait. And then we can compare that to our cerebellar assessments with those rapid coordinated types of movements that I described. And then we look for things that correlate. So in that scenario, that person might be less coordinated with the left side of their body. And then all that information, it kind of validates maybe what you're thinking. And then it's like, all right, we can start, trying some drills to see what will affect this. And the cool thing is, just like our basic range of motion testing that we always talk about as kind of a starting ground, you will see instantaneous changes in both cerebellar output and gait. So one drill, if it's the right drill and the right stimulus, can actually improve that gait pattern. And that's why we're always assessing and reassessing. So I might actually use gait as my main assessment and go, okay, let's go after your cerebellum. Let's do some left-sided complex nonlinear movement. And so now I'm teaching something, maybe a mobility drill for the wrist, the knee, whatever the case. After we do some practice, hey, take a walk for me. Now I'm looking at their gait. Do I see any changes? Same thing with coming back to those rapid alternated movements. Do I see any changes? And if you're on the right path, you actually will experience some upregulation in function and better walking, which is awesome because it gives you validation that you're on the right track.
Yeah. So posture is definitely something I think a lot of people are interested in, right? So like poor posture, asymmetrical posture, hunching over, could point to cerebellar deficit.
It could.
Lack of coordination on one side, both sides of the body. And you also mentioned balance.
Yes.
And just from what you just said, I could kind of see how if you're holding your posture asymmetrically, and that's kind of your set point for your brain, how that could lead to or exacerbate like balance issues, right?
It could. And to go even a step further, glad you said that. When you go a bit deeper in the neurology, and again, you start looking at those zones of the cerebellum. One of them is commonly referred to as the vestibulocerebellum. And so what
there's that vestibular
yeah. So basically, to keep it simple, what it means is that there's a ton of crosstalk between the cerebellum and the vestibular system. So that means your inner ear and the cerebellum, which, by the way, I should have given this kind of visual for our listeners if you're not yet familiar with the cerebellum. And you can certainly just easily Google up an image. But what we're talking about is I always say the little brain that lives underneath the big brain. So when you look at just a very simplistic picture or, graphic of the brain, you see the big cortex on top. And then underneath it, you see this like big bulb, right? This, if the cortex is a cantaloupe, the cerebellum is, a tennis ball kind of thing that lives underneath it. That's the cerebellum. That's what we're talking about.
Underneath it and towards the back?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Yeah. But that makes sense that, like, if your vestibular system is telling you, you're out of balance.
Yep.
It stands to reason that it's sending signals to the part of your brain that's coordinating so that you can adjust your balance, right? Like
Exactly.
that makes a lot of sense to me.
That right there is the basic understanding of balance that we need the entire industry to understand. Because think about how balance is trained. Generally speaking, in the health and fitness industry, balance is trained by doing stability exercises on one leg. And that, I'm not saying that is not good training. That can be good training, but it's not true balance training in my mind, because it does not actually involve the head, neck, and eyes. So we need to make sure that we're moving the head, neck, and eyes to stimulate the vestibular system, right? And the crosstalk between the vestibular system and the cerebellum is quite important. One of the basic, like real simple assessments that we teach people to use, it's one of the first things that we would even do with a client, is called a Romberg's test. And it's real easy. You basically just have your client stand with their feet together in a narrow base. And if it's safe to do so, meaning like, this person doesn't have such significant balance challenges that you're afraid they're going to topple over, you have them close their eyes. And so they're just standing with their eyes closed for, let's say, 20 seconds. And as they're doing that, you are observing for postural sway. And this is really interesting because you might be like, well, just standing there with your eyes closed, that's easy. And to the untrained eye, it might look like the person is very still. But if you look really closely, there actually can be some postural sway taking place where a person might be kind of gravitating more to the right, and they're swaying and then correcting, and swaying and then correcting. Or maybe it's happening to the left, or maybe it's even more circular in nature. And all these things mean something. So these are kind of like the little invisible things that we teach people how to see. And then that particular assessment gets more advanced, I guess you would say, by making the stance more difficult. So by standing in a tandem stance, as if you're on a line, heel to toe, again, just kind of lengthening them up, have the person close their eyes. And now it's much harder. It's much harder because you're removing visual input. If you think about it this way, we orient our bodies so much with the information we're taking in through our eyes. So if we remove the visual system, I guess you would think about it as like the priority shifts, like your nervous system now has to rely more on your proprioceptive system and your vestibular system to understand where you are in space and to help keep you upright. So removing the visual system makes things harder. That's one reason. And it's a way that we get a closer look at what's happening for this person proprioceptively, or what's happening with their inner ear. Because if you see significant sways, that's going to lead you to a possible cerebellar issue or vestibular issue, or both. And sometimes you'll put people in that tandem stance and they'll just fall right over. Like, I don't mean fall on the ground, but I mean like lose their position and have to recover their balance.
Right.
And if our listeners want to try that, you should be able to stand in a tandem stance with either the left foot back or the right foot back. You want to do both without building a significant amount of tension in your body. Remember, your eyes are closed. Okay. And you should be able to maintain that position for quite a while. I mean, I at least want to see you do it for 15 seconds. A lot of adults, especially adults in their 40s and older, will find themselves falling out of that position within 3 seconds. That is not good. Not good. It's really common to see that. It's really common to see that. So I don't have a perfect standard, but again, like I'd love to see you do it for at least 15 seconds on both sides. And it should be more. Okay. But it's something our listeners can try. And you might find that one side is much harder than the other in terms of the stance. And you might find that you keep swaying to one side, but not the other. And those are brain issues. Yeah. It could be several different things. Could be proprioceptive, could be vestibular. There's other things that, ways to kind of look at it. but that ends up being a really good indicator and can be used as an assessment too. It's easy to use that way.
Let's talk about pain for a second.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the drills that you utilize are like knee circles, arm circles,
Yeah.
and turns out that sometimes that can be a very effective tool to mitigate pain, sometimes in the opposite limb of the body, sometimes in the same one, right?
Yep.
I have a sneaking suspicion, since we're talking about complex movements, we're talking about getting off that linear movement to something more round, that it might be related to the cerebellum.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, are there scenarios where we could draw kind of a straight line between a cerebellar deficit and pain?
Yeah, I think so. Again, pain is weird.
Right.
So as much as people want to simplify pain and make it very straightforward, it's never going to be,
Mm-hmm.
because it's more like an emotion, right? It comes and it goes, and it doesn't necessarily represent tissue damage, and it doesn't necessarily represent the severity of an issue. It doesn't necessarily tell you where an issue is. It doesn't necessarily tell you what the issue, or like where to look for, where the problem might be. So it's really weird, pain.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that it is an experience generated by the brain based on tons of different things. Input from local tissues, for sure. So you don't want to confuse this. If you're just getting into pain neuroscience, this is very important information to know, but you want to make sure you don't confuse this, because the pushback on this now is people becoming threatened by the idea that pain is in your brain, meaning it gets translated to pain is in your head, which makes it not real. But that's not what pain neuroscience is saying. Pain neuroscience is saying that pain is a construct of the brain based on lots of different factors. And those factors could be input coming in from local tissues. Meaning, yeah, if you have an injury and there's nociception, which are your threat sensors, sending a bunch of information back to the brain, and the brain goes, "Oh, I sense danger." That can be a cause of pain for sure. But you don't need an injury, is what I'm saying, for that to even take place.
Mm-hmm.
You could have a deconditioned knee that does not have an insult to the tissue. But let's say, kind of more towards what you're asking about, let's say you have a knee that at some point in your life it was injured. So typically when there's an injury, it causes us to move differently for a while. Anytime we have an injury and we move differently, we are experiencing the world differently with that body part. And that becomes or creates a change in input. And change in input over time creates changes in the brain, the same way you would think about plasticity. So this is the kind of humbling part about the nervous system. Change is going to happen for good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can have plasticity happen for bad stuff. So changes happen over time based on moving differently, and that creates plasticity in the brain based on your pain. And so you can think about that as becoming a proprioceptive deficit. So now we have like a map clarity issue where your brain is using a satellite. I like to use this satellite idea because I got a lot of feedback that people liked it. All right, so I'm trying to use it more. Your brain has a satellite that is in charge of mapping, let's say, the knee, right? And we'll say it's your brain's sort of GPS, if you will, and is involved in the proprioception for your knee. If your knee's been injured and you've moved differently for a long time, that satellite is going to be getting low quality sensory input that is developed over time. And your brain doesn't like low quality sensory input because it skews the interpretation of the world. Your brain is always just trying to see, like, it's trying to understand what is happening in the external environment, what is happening in the internal environment. And here's kind of the weird thing. it's all about predictability. So the best way to understand something like that is to be able to predict it. So there's some level of certainty that goes with it. And a knee that's been injured that no longer is receiving good quality input is creating uncertainty for the nervous system. And brains do not like uncertainty. It ramps up threat, and that in itself could cause pain. So that's the example of like a proprioceptive deficit, a map clarity issue, causing threat, which could then cause pain. So the cerebellum can definitely be involved in pain. And that's why we are so interested in this map clarity idea, because by teaching a person how to move their body better, and even looking at it in possibly an isolated way at first, with like joint mobility and stuff, is a really effective way to clarify those maps. And we often see a decrease in pain in doing that.
So you came at it kind of from a proprioceptive perspective. Am I right to say something along the lines of, like, if you improve the extensor tone of a part of your body, that in and of itself could clarify the map, because now it's getting...
Yeah, it can help. So everything in neurology is a two-way street, which is cool. So that means if you know that the cerebellum is largely involved in, let's say, calibrating extensor muscle tone, that means you could literally use extensor tone ideas with, like, let's say, strength training to train the cerebellum. We incorporate a lot of that idea into our drill stacks. So, for example, let's say, and honestly, this is, so back to the knee idea. You have knee pain. Let's say it is being mediated more so by the cerebellum, right? Your knees become less coordinated. So there's a proprioceptive issue. Maybe input problems over time have resulted in loss of sensation. Okay, so now we've got not only a motor deficit, but we've got a sensory deficit. Okay, all these things, again, are adding to that level of threat. In knowing that the cerebellum is involved in extensor tone, one of the solutions for that knee might be stronger extensors. So this is where a lot of people, I want to say, get lucky. And I don't mean that by like, you don't know what you're doing, because you may have known what you're doing. You noticed that they had a lack of extensor tone. And so you had them train their hamstrings.
Right.
And their pain got better. And so you may have clarified a mapping issue in a cerebellar input issue by training the hamstrings, because that could be a part of it. So where we take it further is we understand the complex nonlinear part of this, because it engages the cerebellum more, is how we like to think about it.
It's like a stack of its own almost.
Yes. It's that level of complexity. It's a form of load. So load does not only come in the form of resistance. Load can come in the form of the shape's continuum, like we talked about, with a dot, a line, a cross, a circle, a figure eight, etc. And there's lots of other things we can do that are still, in my mind, types of load that go beyond just resistance. And they're all really good at engaging the cerebellum. So here's where knowing the rest of the story helps, because linear movements, like we talked about a little bit, are just not as exciting for something like the cerebellum. Okay, it's not that the cerebellum's not involved in coordinating linear movement. That's not true. And it is kind of, we have to be careful. Like I have to be careful when I'm teaching, is what I mean, that sometimes people could accidentally take this literally. But one of the things that we say is that, generally speaking, the cerebellum kind of goes to sleep with linear based movement. And it's not that the cerebellum checks out and isn't involved. It's just that there's not a lot of motivation for it to stay engaged as much as a more complex task. So typically the novelty wears off with linear movement if it is in fact helping you with, let's say, a pain issue. And again, sometimes it does solve it. I don't want to say that it can't. But the novelty can wear off, and then that's when you have to recognize through your assessments and experience, like, okay, so we just need to add more load for this person. How can we give them more complexity? Maybe we needed to strengthen their hamstrings, and that's been quite useful. But now we need to teach them how to move their knee in all planes of motion in a complex way. So maybe now we're doing knee circles, and we're loading it with a band. And then that turns into a figure 8. And then eventually that turns into a band-loaded knee circle with a figure 8 with a metronome, where now you're training the tempo and you're giving them a target to time it to. And maybe you stop the metronome for a little bit and you add perturbation, where they're still doing a band-loaded knee figure 8, but maybe a coach is bumping them, right, on the shoulder and trying to interfere with their posture. Maybe I then do that for a little bit. And now I do the same thing, but I have my client close their eyes. Now I'm adding perturbation. They're still doing the band-loaded knee circle, but their eyes are closed to upregulate more proprioceptive activity, more vestibular integration or activity. And so I'm kind of pointing these different ideas out because we also have a continuum for load and complexity. Right. And that's what we talk about in our courses, about learning how to add these different variables to training to engage the cerebellum even more. And that's where all this complex stuff, that's where we have this big toolbox with complex types of movements. And, back to the very beginning conversation at the of this episode, when we're talking about Indian clubs. Mm-hmm. Like, Indian clubs is a great tool that kind of gets away from what I was kind of describing as more isolated drilling to something a bit more generalized, where you're still working on a complex shape. If you think about it, I don't know all the right names because I'm not like an Indian club expert. I just typically
that video looked pretty good to me.
Well, so I don't know the names of exercises. Sure. I don't got to a point where I had to save space in my brain and I forget all names of exercises. And part of that is because I'm such I just like to explore, right? Mm-hmm. And so I believe, like, some people call those like mills. It's a form of a mill. Okay. And there's different kinds of Indian club mills. And what you were describing is basically a figure 8. Mm-hmm. You did a circle in front of the body and a circle behind the body. Mm-hmm. Right? It's the figure 8. It's very novel. It's very complex. So I love that tool for that reason. There's lots of things we can do, but that's a good example.
I promise we're going to talk more about complex movements, but just one more question.
Yeah.
When you said kind of you were very careful to say, your cerebellum isn't actually falling asleep, but it's not as activated with a linear movement than a complex movement. The thing I thought about was, the reflex test at the doctor where they hit your knee and boom, your leg goes up right along that linear hinge. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's some outsourcing to the autonomic, and everything's related, right? But the autonomic parts of your body, you don't think about breathing all the time until you do. You may not even think about walking very much until you do. And so I wonder if, like, the more you have to think about a movement, the less autonomic might not be the technically right word, but the less automatic it is, the more theoretically you have to activate other parts of your brain to do things, right?
100%. The reflex test with the leg on the table and you tap the patellar and it jumps off the table, that there's actually a lot of cerebellar activation or just cerebellar involvement in that reflex.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's the cerebellum helps to set the tone for that reflex, because you're tapping on a tendon and you're getting like a rebound effect, as if the muscles have been stretched. Like there's typically like a stretch, like a muscle stretch reflex. It's
that's
a safe,
interesting.
yeah, it's like a safety reflex, right? So that we don't rip our bodies in half by accident, right? It's like, it's safety. We have a lot of reflexes that ensure our safety through movement, and the cerebellum is very much involved in regulating that reflex. And when you tap a tendon like that and there's a response, that's like the stretch muscle reflex basically, and it is like your built-in shocks that you never have to think about, right? They're just there. That's what tendons do for us. So it's funny that you said that one, because the cerebellum is involved, and I test those reflexes on people from time to time when I feel it's appropriate, and you can actually lose those reflexes, which is not a good thing.
Yeah.
And that can be in part a cerebellar issue. One example is that I had a client with pretty severe scoliosis that I worked with for a number of years. She was an athlete, and she suffered from lots of fractures and strain to the tissue type injuries. Very athletic, very strong. She could Bulgarian split squat as much as she could hold. She was very strong. I mean, one day we had her Bulgarian split squat just for fun. She had like 170 pounds because we had weighted vests stacked on her.
Yeah.
Dumbbells in each hand, you name it. Like she was very strong. At the time, she was only 18 years old. These were big legs. And she was strong enough to Bulgarian split squat that kind of weight. But then in her sport, which was alpine ski racing, she was constantly getting injured and like literally breaking bones. And come to find out, none of her spinal cord reflexes, or her deep tendon reflexes is what people know that as. None of them were working.
So she was not protecting her bones at all.
Bingo.
Yeah.
She had no plyometric abilities because her shocks were not working properly. And she had voluntary strength, though. This is a good example of what we mean when we say that voluntary strength is different from reflexive strength. Voluntarily, she could say, okay, I'm going to Bulgarian split squat this amount of weight. And she was able to do it. But reflexively, when she didn't have that level of focus, like cognition towards the movement, when it was more reflexive, like in an athletic event, she didn't have the reflexive stability. And those reflexes, because they weren't serving her, she had a much higher risk for those strain type injuries. I mean, she would throw her elbow out playing tennis. She'd hit the tennis ball and hyperextend her elbow because of this. Even if she wasn't hitting it hard, she just hit it just right where things got weird. Yeah. Then she suffered a hyperextension. So you can imagine with the forces that she had to go under with ski racing, she was at a higher risk for injury. So it's funny, the cerebellum, you said that reflex, and that's a good one to bring up. Cerebellum's going to be involved in kind of a reflexive, role with stability.
So one could even argue like a healthy cerebellum is useful for injury prevention and not
Definitely.
not just improving coordination and whatnot.
Yep, you could make that argument.
Very cool. Well, let's talk about complex training.
Yeah.
And I think it would be really cool to just kind of get into more of like the nuts and bolts of like how you incorporate it and how do you get better at it.
So are we talking? It's almost like I feel like we're about to talk about more general training for complex movements. Is that what you're thinking, or is it more isolated? When I say isolated, I mean like, okay, my client has shown me that they have a left side cerebellar deficit. What do I do? Because that approach has to be asymmetric. Whereas when I'm throwing around my Indian clubs and twirling them around and having a good time with both sides of the body, I'm not really being isolated in an asymmetric way. And it doesn't mean it doesn't have value, but it's more generalized training in my mind. Yeah.
Let's do an example of both because I think they're both extremely useful.
Yeah. So tools, you think like kind of heading into like different ideas and tools for it?
Yeah. So
Okay.
like,
Yeah.
let's start with the person that has shown an asymmetry. They did the palm test,
Hmm.
and I did it real quick while you were talking, and I feel like my left hand isn't quite as fast and as
Hmm.
coordinated as my right hand.
Hmm. Hmm.
Just my
Yep.
impression. What
Yep.
what is what is
Yeah.
something I can do?
Okay. Yeah. So, and we would never really do one test and make a bunch of decisions off one test. So, like,
Fair.
I would follow
Fair.
up and say, okay, I want you to tap your right foot on the ground as fast as you can for 6 seconds. I want you to tap your left foot as fast as you can for 6 seconds. Did you get the same result? Is it the left side that's still not as coordinated, or is it the right side? Because you can have mixed
Mhm.
findings.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So we do other tests, but let's say,
Gait assessment, a
yeah,
couple other things.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Let's say you were the left cerebellar deficit. And I want to cover this too, because the first question I always get, I already started getting it in the course. Does hand dominance play a role in this? So let's say you're a left cerebellar deficit, according to our assessment flow, and you are right hand dominant. And the answer is yes, it absolutely plays a role. It's almost like at first people want to think that the assessment results don't matter now.
Right.
If
Oh, it's
hand
just
if
it's just my right hand's
Yeah, it's
better.
no big
So
deal because like
yeah.
I'm supposed to be a righty and like it's normal to have better coordination on one side of the body than the other. And that is true. I do think that is normal. But when the deficit gets too big, now we have a problem. And it's easy for the deficit to get too big because if you're going through the world leading with the right side of your body and doing everything with the right side of the body, or at least more than the left, well, what does that become over time? An input problem. Because proprioceptively, you're not moving your left side as much, which means you're not getting as much motor activity, you're not getting as much sensory activity. There are consequences to that up the chain with your brain. And so I do think that humans have a right and a left, brain for a reason. I think that it's not necessarily supposed to be, we're not supposed to be perfectly symmetric creatures. We're not built like that. We have, to the untrained eye, we are symmetric beings. But if you look at like our anatomy, it's not as symmetric as you think, particularly the internal organs and stuff. And hand dominance is a real thing. So hand dominance plays into this. And if you're a right-handed person, but you have a left cerebellar deficit, well, you still have a left cerebellar deficit and you still want to improve that.
Mhm.
So what we might do is, this is the first thing I did when I found mine years ago, is I might teach somebody some joint mobilizations. They're essentially motor control drills because that they challenge your coordination. Most of them are circles and figure eights and stuff like that. I would want to practice those on the left side of the body, like pretty regularly. So that means if you're like warming up for your workout, you might do all your motor control drills as a warm up. You might do them on your left side
Mhm.
to upregulate your left cerebellum and your right cortex. And that by itself might actually really help you with your performance afterward. And then over time, with enough practice, if you're understand the intention of how to get better at the drill and what kind of targets you're trying to hit, that by itself can help the cerebellum because most people have never done anything that novel. So that's what I did early on because I had a left cerebellar deficit. And as a result, I had other things going on in my right cortex and right PMRF. If people want to learn more about that, we have a whole episode on the neurology of movement. We talk about
Mhm.
that loop. So for me, I did about 70% of my joint mobility on the left side of my body. And I was very committed to that probably did it for like 6 months. And it doesn't mean that I wasn't doing anything on the right side of my body, but as far as that stuff goes, I was more concentrated on the left. And that made a huge difference for me.
Hmm.
So I was doing all the movement on my left, but the right side of my body was actually getting the most benefit, which is
Interesting.
that loop we talk about where I had actually developed more muscle tone issues on the right side of my body. And again, people can reference that episode on the neurology of movement, but moving the left side of the body stimulates the right cortex, which stimulates the right PMRF, which is the brainstem. That has a big influence on setting global muscle tone on that side of the body. So that's why you can observe that somebody has muscle tone issues on their right, and all of that might actually be coming from a coordination problem on their left. So by clearing this up, clarifying the maps, getting better at moving on the left, we might see that kind of a result. On the other side of the body, which is kind of interesting, but also locally, right? You can also locally. So joint mobility like that, bias to the weaker cerebellar side, in my mind, is one of the best starting points. Okay. Now, we could also integrate some vision and vestibular exercises into this. The cerebellum is very much involved in eye movement. So think about how eye movements are like the finest of finest motor control, right? And the cerebellum is very involved in coordinating eye movements. Any vision exercise that we do is involving the cerebellum. Now it does get heavy, and I won't really go into it, like the directionality stuff in the podcast. That's for people who are real nerds that want to take the courses. And you don't necessarily need to know it too. I want to make that clear. Like, if you just want to be a person who does something healthy for themselves, you can just go do all the vision exercises that I have on YouTube.
Yep.
And get something really good from it as far as your cerebellar goes. Quick side note, I just returned a direct message, a DM on Instagram from a lady who messaged last night. She said, I started doing all your vision exercises on YouTube because I had a shoulder problem. And she said, I noticed that with some committed practice, my shoulder was starting to feel better. So I kept doing them. She said, then the weirdest thing happened. The last couple of years, she explains that she had developed a problem parking her car. And she always felt like it was a weird brain thing. Because that's like when someone feels that and they don't know terminology and stuff, they're like, it almost seems like a brain thing. And she could not park her car accurately anymore. And she had stopped parallel parking because she couldn't do it without hitting the curb. And then it was like really stressing her out.
Wow. Yeah.
And she was very nervous about it because it felt disorienting in a way. It wasn't, it's hard to explain, but when you lose reflexive function, or I should say unconscious function, it's kind of scary.
Yeah, it's threatening for sure.
Yeah, it's like, wait a minute, what's happening here? Like, I know what I need to do, but I can't do it, and something's off. So the cool part of the story is she said the vision training completely restored her ability to park. And she was blown away because she had gone to some different medical professionals, and you know what the hell told her? Like, you're in menopause and changes like this happen. Sorry. She made sure to tell me that. And she's like, I can't believe it. She was so fired up in the DM. She's like, you guys are amazing for sharing this information.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Awesome.
I can park my car without, fear anymore. And my shoulder's feeling better and better as I go. I thought that was really
so
cool.
Yeah, that's so cool.
It's neat when you hear about victories like that kind of pop up in other areas of your life that you weren't expecting. Before I got on the tangent, so we talked about the connection between the eyes and the cerebellum. So there's a lot of directionality to it. So for the health and movement pros that want to learn that, like, this is what we teach in the courses. You can do your vision exercises to specific directions, depending on the type of eye exercise that it is. And you can
tracking left, jumping right, stuff like that. We talked about that last episode.
That's right.
Too.
Yeah, exactly. And you can potentially increase more activation to one part of the cerebellum versus another, right? There's a lot of contributions of many structures to eye movements, but you can kind of get ninja with it, if you know what I mean. Like, it takes time. It's like a lot of learning. I'm still learning. I will put it this way. I will never know the full neurology of eye movements throughout my entire lifespan. I will never know it all. That's all. That's the only way to put it. It's so vast, And it's so complicated that, and we keep learning, right? We keep learning, but we can learn enough that helps us make these targeted decisions that we see help, right, in the functional outcomes of what we're doing. But it's kind of exciting though. I like knowing that there's just so much, you know,
There's
you can
more
just,
to do. Yeah.
there's more to do. You can keep going with it. Vision exercises, vestibular exercises. We mentioned the connection, the vestibular cerebellum. Any vestibular input is going to involve the cerebellum. So now these basic like VORs that we're teaching, or VORCs, these are all reflexes that we're training in kind of a voluntary way that could be included in cerebellar training. So left-sided joint mobilizations, maybe some VORs, and maybe some smooth pursuits, right? That's what I mean, is that that's starting to kind of look like a typical starting ground for addressing cerebellar deficits. And here's the other thing. Again, it kind of depends on the zone of the cerebellum you're trying to go after, but we want complexity and we want accuracy. So that might mean that we have to kind of involve like a hand-eye type of coordination, where you have a target, whether you're catching a ball or touching a specific target. And oftentimes we want to make it quite non-forgiving in a sense, where it's actually a difficult target. Okay. That stuff's wonderful for cerebellar training. Imagine this. I was doing this a couple weeks ago. I was just playing. I have these bean bags basically that I like to juggle. Juggling is a great cerebellar activity too, and it has everything in it, right? The accuracy, the balance, the coordination. But you can imagine if you have a left cerebellar deficit, you put the bean bag in your left hand, throw it up in the air, touch your left knee, catch it. Or throw it up in the air, touch your right shoulder, catch it. Simple, but it's a targeted drill for the left cerebellum. And you can involve, I mean, you can go so many places with that just for fun. But if you only wanted to do more left cerebellar training with that, then catching and throwing with that left side, or creating some sort of targeted drill. We have a set of drills called toe targeting, where you set up targets like a piece of paper on a wall. And let's say left cerebellar deficit, you're going to have the person standing on their right leg, but they're going to touch the targets on the wall with the big toe on their left foot. And maybe they're doing that at the exact same time as a left wrist circle. Now we have the dual tasking component that's going to make everything harder, but also engage the cerebellum even more.
Right.
Maybe I have them gaze stabilizing. So that's a vision exercise. It's essentially holding your eyes on a target. Maybe I have them gaze stabilizing on a very specific visual target that's going to increase some cerebellar activity as well while they're doing something else, while they're doing the wrist circle, right? Or anything, really. There's a lot you can do. The creative mind goes wild when you get the fundamentals of neuro. At first, when people are learning how to use it, it can be intimidating because it's like there's infinite options, right? But then you get to a point where it's very freeing. You're like, oh, I see what I'm trying to do here. I can create any drill I want as long as I stick to the basic principles.
Right.
And then a test, retest. Was it a good idea or not? You get to find out, you know? Yeah. So lots of, just creativity using that left side of the body, accuracy, balance, just balance challenges on the left side of the body. Even if we're balancing on the left leg while doing something, could be a vision exercise.
Right. Looking in different directions rapidly, different targets, right?
Could be juggling. Maybe you know how to juggle, balance on the left leg, do some juggling. There's lots of things. And I should say this, I encourage everybody to learn how to juggle. Just general training, awesome activity. It's great to learn something new, a skill like that, because I think that adults fall into this thing where eventually they just stop learning stuff accidentally. And trying something new and sticking to it and really working at it, there's a lot of benefit in that. And I teach juggling. I'm not an amazing juggler. I can juggle three balls, bean bags, whatever. I can't do more than that. Like and I'm reasonable at it, but I keep it in my training and I keep checking in with it and play around with different things, utilizing it. It's a great hand-eye coordination skill. It trains your eyes. So you get a lot of visual saccades because your eyes are jumping back and forth as the balls that you're juggling are kind of peaking on the curve. You're basically doing a bunch of right and left visual saccades. You can also juggle only using peripheral vision, which is kind of neat, where you're sort of looking through the balls, but you're still focused on them with your peripheral vision. And you can do tons of stuff. You can walk while juggling while getting down on the floor and getting back up again. So fun.
You're just one step away from juggling on a unicycle.
Yep, juggling on a unicycle. And if you are intimidated by learning how to juggle, which by the way, you can just get on YouTube. There's a million great tutorials that can help you learn. And one of the ways that I've been successful teaching clients is by having them buy nylon scarves, like on Amazon. They're just literally like nylon. It's like woven nylon, maybe 12 by 12 square. And you throw these things up in the air and they open like a parachute and float down, and they're different colors.
So you have a little more hang time to react.
I've taught like 9-year-olds how to juggle in 15 minutes with these things. It's really cool. Like, it's like this building process that happens in the moment. It's not like, hey, in 4 weeks, hopefully you'll be able to juggle. Like, you can actually see it happen in a number of minutes if you practice kind of bringing them through a progression, and then they can transition to like balls or something. It's a great skill. I encourage you to put it in your fitness, regimen as a part of a warm up / skill session, and your brain will certainly benefit.
I'm still imagining a KRUSE Elite Neuro summer camp for kids where you're just doing all this type of stuff. Yeah, that would be really awesome.
Be really cool.
So, kind of inverting the question a little bit, we've talked about, how you might target a specific deficit, whether it's asymmetrical or just cerebellar in general, different types of drills and tools you can use. Of course, these are also assessments, right, when used correctly. But how would you, to flip the question around, how would you use neuro to help support someone getting better at a specific complex task? So like juggling, for example, besides slowing down and using the scarves, like, would you train the left side of the body for coordination to get better at juggling? Like, is that something that you would do? Would you do vision drills to get better at juggling?
Yeah. I mean, this is like, in my mind, like, this is why I love applied neuro right here. Skill development. It's not really like, it's great that applied neuro is useful for pain because pain is an obstacle for people, but it gets really fun when you start using it for skill development. And so, yes, let's say you're teaching somebody how to be more coordinated with the left side of their body, and they have, deficits that you can see through your testing, or they're performing some sort of athletic activity and they are already aware that they are less coordinated with that side of their body. Okay, maybe it's you, Tony, with your Indian clubs, and you notice that you're not doing the mill as coordinated on the left side of your body because of a left side cerebellar issue. Now, we can approach that through cerebellar training. So we could do what we've already described. We could use complex nonlinear movements on the left side of the body and then retest and see, did that help? That's the first starting point. That's the lowest hanging fruit. As you start to get deeper into neuro and you understand pathways, you now get to make a lot of different decisions that could influence cerebellar function that seem completely unrelated, which is where it gets really cool and fun. So, for example, if you have a left side cerebellar deficit, we can't just say it's a left cerebellar problem. We have to also consider that because we're evaluating a movement, we have to think about, where does movement come from? What other contributing structures are involved? So that means for the left cerebellum, we have to also think about the right cortex, because a voluntary movement is coming from that right cortex. A large part of the decision-making that goes into creating that movement is coming from the opposite cortex. It's one example. So could we select a drill that is primarily targeted at the opposite cortex and see an improvement in cerebellar function from doing that? And the answer is yes, because none of these things are completely separate, because there's all these pathways and these structures work together to create movement. So, for example, let's say we wanted to use a vision exercise to help left-sided coordination. If we look at like the directionality of saccades, which is a fast eye movement between two targets, we know that if I saccade to the left, that's going to be driven from the right cortex primarily. There's a lot of activation coming from the right cortex to do that. And we know that the cerebellum is going to be involved in trying to help stop the eyes precisely on the target. This is where it gets cool. That means I could do a leftward saccade, several of them. I could isolate that left side where I have a person looking at a visual target in front of them. They saccade left, close their eyes, return to center. Saccade left, close their eyes, return to center. And maybe they do 10 of these things. And what we're doing with that direction of the saccade is increasing right brain activity and left cerebellar activity. Then we might follow up with whatever left-sided coordination task we were using, whether we were practicing it or it was just a very, standard assessment. We would see, can we mark any changes in the proficiency of that? And it's amazing because oftentimes you will. If you're nailing things with figuring out, okay, this is likely the pattern. So that then opens up lots of ideas and doors to all these other things you can do. So then you look at it, and we're looking at it very simplistically because we have to. If we go heavy, then we start losing application. So let's say we activated your right brain using leftward saccades, and we got improved coordination immediately. Well, I'm sending you home to practice leftward saccades, included with your left cerebellar homework, because we're now going to use the saccades to support you in the learning of the actual cerebellar work that we're doing.
It's kind of like a stack also, right?
It is a stack. Exactly. And you could do the saccades right before you do the motor work, the cerebellar work you're doing. Sometimes there are ways to stack them together if a person needs that. It's kind of a different conversation for, why stack. And basically we're just trying to make a stronger stimulus. Sometimes you need that. Sometimes you don't. But let's say we learn something from that. We go, oh, okay. Let's just say we helped Tony improve the coordination with his Indian club exercise on the left side of the body by having him do leftward visual saccades. What else now can we do that's similar? So maybe we approach it through sensation. We're now looking at kind of a different level of neurology. And we know that all sensory input goes to the contralateral cortex except for smell. So I might say, hey, Tony, you know that massage tool you have, whatever, the vibrating foam roller that some people own or whatever the case might be, turn that thing on and vibrate your left foot for 20 seconds and then see if you're more coordinated on your left. By vibrating your left foot, could be any part of the body. I just said left foot because simple. So we are creating vibratory stimulus on the left foot. All sensory input eventually is processed in the opposite cortex. So that means we're technically activating your right brain. A lot of parietal lobe activation when we get into sensory. And then we retest and you're better. You are more coordinated. Oh, okay. So now we just learned that we can also use sensory ideas to upregulate the left cerebellum. So now maybe your little homework routine is leftward visual saccades combined with the left motor control work that we do have to practice to get you more coordinated, but you're also vibrating your left foot at the same time. And all this is helping you learn, right? It's helping you learn. And that is the ultimate, in my mind, that's the ultimate value of neuro, is skill development like that.
So I'm getting really excited right now because I'm thinking about someone wanting to improve their golf swing or someone wanting to
Totally.
improve their free throw.
Yeah.
And if there's a cerebellar deficit,
Mm-hmm.
just kind of doing this stuff right beforehand, if you assess it, you could improve your coordination. Maybe you get a
Yep.
more consistent swing, a more consistent free throw.
No question. I have friends / colleagues and stuff that, I've been kept in touch with over the years that have studied a lot of the same stuff. And I can think of a few of them that use this specifically with golfers, for
Wow.
that reason, to find the right drills that help them in the moment with the swing. I mean, gosh, I even know of a few people who are singing coaches using applied neuro to help people sing. And it's very fascinating.
That's cool.
I follow a few of them on Instagram, and they always have cool posts of like, and I know nothing about singing, certainly can't sing myself, but I can easily see and hear the difference after some of the drills, which is just another classic example of whatever motor output you're trying to improve. If you understand sensory inputs, you can do it.
Yeah.
Which is what's so cool.
It also makes me wonder, a lot of people when they go to the free throw line in basketball, they have like a set thing that they do. They bounce the ball a certain way, a certain number of times. They look up, they look down, they look up, they look down, and then they take the shot every time. And I always thought it was just sort of like a focus thing, which I'm sure it is, right? Like, okay, if I do this the same every time, puts me in a headspace. But now I'm wondering, I'm like, is that a visual saccade? Are they using their left hand to do something? Is there a cerebellar stimulus? I just wonder.
Yeah, I don't know the answer, but it's cool to think about those things. And humans are good at being like sensory seekers and figuring out like little things that are helping them in some way.
Yeah,
it's funny to think about that, because I know I see that all the time with clients, and they explain something that they do routinely because it helps them move better or feel better, and they're essentially sensory seeking, which is more of a term that mostly gets used in like developmental arena with children,
right. Yeah,
because children can be sensory seekers for different reasons as their brain is developing, and adults still do it. Yeah, they still do it, and it's interesting.
So fine motor control.
Yeah.
What about handwriting with your offhand?
Yeah, well,
that's brushing your teeth with your offhand.
Yep. So it's a motor output, right? So so not long ago, actually, I was doing a live call in our community. And I just look for fun things to do sometimes, like, all right, it's going to be a little random, but let's have some fun. And I had people, because our students love to get involved in the assess reassess on a live call. It's something we can all do together versus just listening to me blab. We can actually do something, try something, and then share results in the chat box.
Cool.
And so one day I was like, hey, let's do something a little different today. Let's use writing with our offhand as our assessment.
Cool.
And so I had people just grab a pen and a piece of paper, and they were writing their name. So, okay, you get one try, write your name on a piece of paper with, and that's your test. And then we did some drills, and it was really cool. We did a lot of cerebellar things. We did a lot for the parietal lobe. We were just trying different drills, and people were reporting pretty significant increases in handwriting with certain drills, which was really neat.
That's cool.
Yeah, I need to do that again. I forgot about it until you said that. And so I think what you were getting at is like, can I brush my teeth with my non-dominant hand or my cerebellar deficit side?
Right.
Is that good for me? Maybe, right? And I think it is. Like doing those types of tasks where you're using the weaker cerebellar side, I think has value for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Is there anything we left on the table?
One thing I just thought of, this is very important regarding the cerebellum, is that, well, actually, I'll make it quick, and it's two things.
Cool.
So the first one is, to improve cerebellar function, you have to make sure you're challenging yourself enough. It can't be easy. but it can't be so hard that you're failing more of the time. There's kind of a sweet spot to that. Kind of gets into like a deliberate practice and a flow state, if you will, where, and athletes do this great. They just naturally kind of understand that the practice is, it's a hardship and it's challenging and you're going to fail, but we actually invite the mistakes, and it's actually shown to be better for plasticity and for learning, to actually make mistakes and correct them. One of the roles that the cerebellum plays is error detection and error correction. So that means when you make a movement and it's not as coordinated as you wanted, your cerebellum identifies that and then makes a correction to try to do it better the next time. So part of cerebellar training is to push the person, for doing this with a client or yourself, to make those mistakes but correct them. That's key. Because if it's too easy, your brain sort of loses its motivation, if you will, and it's not rewarding enough. You know what I mean? So that's the first idea. The second one is, if you want to improve the health of the cerebellum and improve overall motor control, you really need to make sure that you have the fuel capacity to do it. So we talk a lot about fuel. We have in previous episodes. It's something we're always discussing in our courses and stuff. The cerebellum is incredibly metabolically involved. So what that means is that it takes a lot of energy. What the cerebellum does takes a lot of energy. And so if you have some kind of energy problem, your coordination is going to suffer. And so sometimes, like, our students know, when you run cerebellar assessments on people and they're showing you lots of coordination problems is not normal. So if you do all the cerebellar tests and you're like, oh, geez, I mean, maybe they were tapping their right foot reasonably well, but like their hand flips were terrible on both sides. Their Romberg's assessments, they're falling out of position within 3 seconds. We have a lot of other cerebellar tests where you like tap your fingers and everything was kind of lousy looking. A lot of times what you're seeing is a struggling cerebellum that is not getting enough blood supply and activation. So it's important to know that. And this is something that I think is more common to see this kind of in a clinic, right? Because, for example, a lot of people in clinics doing good concussion rehabilitation are familiar with this. And there are different things that they're trying to support their patients with in the recovery process, because they know that fuel is very important for the brain to heal, right? You need blood flow. Mm-hmm. But this also, in the work that I do, subclinical, where we're looking for all these little things, these little deficits, fuel still is a big part of that. And so I've actually worked with athletes and stuff that had really lousy cerebellar function, even though they were great at what they did, that all really came back to maybe bad nutritional habits or different metabolic concerns, right? There's so many things that kind of fall under the umbrella of what a fuel deficit could be coming from. Maybe it's a breathing dysfunction. There's lots of options. So
lack of sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Coordination suffers. So the point is, know that, and that's another thing, to kind of build a case for how important the nutrition side of things is, and gut health, because you could eat healthy, but if you have gut problems, you might not be getting the nutrients that you think you're putting in your body. There's so many things, right? Breathing is a tool that we lean on to help people with fuel issues. And we often will use certain breathing exercises to help improve cerebellar function if we suspect that somebody is struggling from more of a fuel perspective. All right, there it is. I hope you guys enjoyed that episode on complex movement in the cerebellum. Make sure you teach yourself how to juggle. Really, teach yourself how to juggle. It's important. I think it's a great starting point too. Grab those scarves that I talked about. And if you're not able to get your hands on scarves, I've had clients grab plastic bags from like grocery shopping and start there, where you just chuck them in the air and start developing the hand-eye coordination to catch them and throw them across your body. It's a great skill. And then from there, maybe run a couple of the cerebellar assessments that I talked about with the hand flips, right, left and right, the toe tapping left and right. See if you can get a sense for where your deficit side might be hiding in terms of the cerebellum. And then you can take that information and you can start to challenge yourself on that same side where you have the weaker coordination. You start to challenge yourself with some of the exercises that you can find over on our YouTube channel, or anything that you're already doing. And you'll be off to the races and starting to train your cerebellar system or your cerebellum. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll be back soon.